counselor self-efficacy and trauma treatment, a quantitative review. As we go through, and I don't know, nobody here has copies, but Tracy and Penny, I'll be just using a lot of the copy of the dissertation itself. Rather than have 800 slides, I kept it to a minimal and just using those as a reference. So if you have questions, I mean, I've got my dissertation in front of me or anything like that, okay?
Sounds great.
All right. So moving on to slide 1. First thing I wanted to explain is how it began. The whole idea of studying counselor self-efficacy or trauma counseling self-efficacy began with the idea of trauma counseling competence. Most of it, as a lot of people experience when they start out as counselors, there's a feeling of incompetence, the feelings of the imposter syndrome, and my experiences were no less than that. I got a job working as a trauma counselor and felt pretty inadequate. This was in about 2005, 2006, somewhere around there. And, well, October of 2005 is when I got into it. And I remember just sitting with these clients and hearing their stories and going, well, I wasn't taught any of this stuff. I don't know what to do. And so, luckily, I did work with a fella who knew what he was doing, and he supervised me for the next 2.5 years, and even beyond that. And so, there was definitely a consistent feeling of incompetence for quite some time, as well as just not feeling very efficacious at doing the job. But however, as I started to study and I started focusing on competence, which I'm going to go into here in a few minutes, I found that it actually wasn't incompetence that I was feeling, but it was actually a sense of not having any efficacy at doing this particular type of job. And so when I first began this study in competence, I found that it wasn't actually incompetence I was experiencing. It was the belief that I could actually carry out the task and have a positive outcome. That had to do with, in my opinion at the time, again this was several years ago, of my lack of experience as well as my lack of education in trauma treatment. And the more and more I worked in trauma, the more I could see that there was a lot of trauma and a whole lot of not training in it. So that's how it began. So in the dissertation itself, I don't first go over trauma, but I want to kind of go over it a little bit today. What I began studying and learning from was Herman's book. I know Penny, you and I have talked about this book quite a bit, Trauma and Recovery. And in that book, Herman goes through the history of history of trauma studies and trauma treatment. And it's extremely fascinating. She goes from the beginnings of when trauma started being studied in a hospital in Paris. And I believe it was called, well, I can't speak French, so it's Saint-Patriere. we'll call it that. And it was run by a fellow named Charcot. Charcot worked with many other people such as Sigmund Freud, William James, Pierre Janet, and a few others who are kind of big names from those times, from the late 1800s. And Charcot's original studies were in hysteria. And he would carry on these activities, Tuesday forums, where he would invite dignitaries and aristocratic folks to come and meet these clients at this hospital. And he would use hypnosis. It was a show. It was almost like a Las Vegas show where he would use hypnosis to decrease symptoms of hysteria, which later on as they studied, it looked a whole lot like complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So he'd use hypnosis to decrease it or even to bring on more symptoms. And so it was a show. But that's how it started. And then Freud went on and did other things, as well as Pierre Janet and several others. Kind of an important aspect that I wanted to point out in today's presentation, though, is why I was so fascinated by this, and that's with this first piece here. According to Vanderkolk, McFarlane, and Weissef, PTSD is a common disorder. They reported that 1 out of 5 adolescents surveyed in this particular study were victims of sexual or physical abuse or witnesses to other abuses, And out of those adolescents, 23% develop PTSD. And it goes on, and I talk about it. Not everybody develops classic-looking PTSD, especially children and adolescents. It doesn't have the flashbacks. It doesn't have necessarily the nightmares or the replayings of any kind of traumatic event. It's much more developmentally appropriate. And so, rather than there being anxiety, there are anger manifestations or behavioral abnormalities, hyperactivity. And so children and adolescents are overdiagnosed with, for example, ADHD, and then they're medicated for it and nothing happens, yet they continue to medicate it. And when I started out doing this work, that's what I saw. I'd get all these kids in my office, their parents, saying, we don't know what to do with this kid or with this adolescent. They're so messed up, and that's their words, we don't know what to do. We're thinking about putting him in a home or her in a home because they're just uncontrollable, and their ADHD meds don't work. They're put on mood stabilizers. I mean, it was absolutely phenomenal, the things they were doing. And then after taking a history, we would find that there was long-term neglect or some type of abuse that had been going on, and it was a form of trauma. So that's kind of just a brief background history of the trauma piece. Now,